Open your eyes.
The fact of the matter is, we can do all we need to do without punishing anybody. China is going to eat our lunch? Come on, man.
In May of 2019, Joe Biden appeared in Iowa and said China is not an economic threat to the United States. China's going to eat our lunch? Come on, man. This is World Bank data on GDP using purchasing power parity comparison by country, comparing China's gross domestic product, which is their economic output, compared to the United States. We signed a new trade deal with China in the year 2000. At that time, their economy was 1/3 of our size. Watch what happened since. And keep in mind, for 8 of the years you're about to see, Joe Biden was vice president, yet he doesn't think they're a threat. So China's economy was 1/3 of our size, and by 2006, they're half of our size. And by 2009, they're 2/3 of our size. And China passed the United States in terms of purchasing power parity in the year 2013. And they're expected to pass us in regular GDP, which is a different measure, by the year 2032.
Of recent trade deals,
yes,
and some not so recent. Do you believe as president you would have the authority to unravel some of them immediately?
I think, look, for Vermont, for Iowa, and for virtually the entire country, trade agreements like Nafta, CAFTA, and permanent normal trade relations with China have by and large been a disaster. I voted against all of them, and I'm helping to lead the effort right now against the Trans-Pacific Partnership. At the end of the day, I think what Americans perceive, and you ask me why there is momentum for our campaign, these trade agreements were written by corporate America, were written by Wall Street. The goal was to shut down plants in America, to stop having to pay workers in Iowa, Vermont, this country, decent wages, move to China, pay people low wages, and bring their products back in America.
But supported by Democratic administrations.
In the year 2000, Bill Clinton signed a trade deal with China, which said China could sell goods in the United States tax-free. And if we tried to sell a Chevy Camaro or a Ford Mustang or a Ford F-150 pickup truck to China, they would tax that import at 25%.
An article from the New York Times, March of 2017, shortly after President Trump took office. And as you scroll down here, March 20th of 2017, a Jeep Wrangler can cost $30,000 more in China than in the United States. The retail price of the Wrangler is $40,500 in the USA, but in China the same vehicle can set you back $71,000, mostly because of the taxes Beijing charges on every car or minivan that's brought into the country. Later in the article it says fewer than 5% of the cars in China are imported. Meanwhile, if a car is made in China and brought into our country, the tax is less than 2%.
Look what happens over time as we go through the 90s. By 1997, China's made some improvement. Their economy is at $961 billion, but we're at $8.5 trillion. We're still 10 times larger than they are. As we go forward to the year 2001, this is the first full calendar year the trade deal Bill Clinton signed into law. Watch what happens to China's GDP. They go from 1.3 trillion, we're at 10 trillion. So again, they're roughly 1/8 or 1/9 of our size. 5 years later, China's at 2.7 trillion. We're at 13 trillion. Now they're roughly 1/6 or 1/7 our size. By the year 2013, China's at 9.5 trillion. We're at 16 trillion. They're more than half of our size. Look at this growth from 2006, 7, 8, 10, 11, 12. So in the year 1990, China's economy wasn't even close to 1/10 of our size. Now they're 2/3 of the size of the U.S. economy.
The former vice president and 2020 Democratic hopeful on the campaign trail, downplaying China as a threat to the United States. Listen to Mr. Biden.
I've met virtually every major world leader in my role, as vice president and as foreign relations chairman over the last 30 years. And that's not hyperbole. China is going to eat our lunch? Come on, man. They're not competition for us.
Not competition for us.
This graph shows the effect on manufacturing in the United States of this trade deal that was supported by President Bill Clinton, who signed it into law in December of 2000. It was proposed by Republicans like John McCain, George W. Bush. We lost 5 million manufacturing jobs in this country from the moment China joined the World Trade Organization until the year 2009. We went from 17 million manufacturing jobs in this country to less than 12 million.
You're quite right. Many of these policies, you're absolutely right. Many of these policies were supported by not only Republicans, by President Clinton and, unfortunately, President Obama. They are bad policies. They are opposed, by and large, by every trade union in this country, and I believe by the majority of the American people. At the end of the day, the American worker should not be forced to compete against people in Vietnam who make 56 cents an hour minimum wage.
How do you roll back the clock on those agreements?
Well, you renegotiate agreements. And what you say is, look, we want agreements that work for the American middle class. I want to see, we have lost, just to review, since 2001, we have lost almost 60,000 factories in the United States of America and millions of decent paying jobs. Not all of that is attributable to trade, but a lot of it is. And at the end of the day, if corporations can shut down in America, pay people 25 cents an hour, 50 cents an hour someplace else, that's what they will do. And we have got to stop that. We have to demand they reinvest back in this country and provide decent paying jobs here.
May have noticed following this election, Donald Trump came to Indiana and talked a lot about what happened with the Carrier Corporation and shipping their jobs out of state.
The moment executives informed workers they were eliminating 1,400 jobs.
To move production from our facility in Indianapolis to Monterrey, Mexico.
Trump saw it on the news and promised he wouldn't let that happen.
We're not going to let our jobs be taken away.
Here's someone who worked for Carrier, and he has a question for you.
How you doing, Mr. President?
How are you?
My name is Eric Cottenham, and I'm representing the Steelworkers Union, Local 1999, and I'm trying to find out what do we have left for as all of our jobs are leaving Indianapolis, right? And I see here you're doing a lot of things, but in Indianapolis, there's nothing there for us. I mean, what's next? I mean, what can we look forward to in the future as far as jobs, employment, whatever, because all of our jobs is left or in the process of leaving, sir.
Well, for those folks who've lost their job right now because a plant went down to Mexico, that isn't going to make you feel better. And so what we have to do is to make sure that folks are trained for the jobs that are coming in now, because some of those jobs of the past are just not going to come back. And when somebody says, like the person you just mentioned, who I'm not going to advertise for, that he's going to bring all these jobs back. Well, how exactly are you going to do that? What are you going to do? There's no answer to it. He just says, well, I'm going to negotiate a better deal. Well, how exactly are you going to negotiate that? What magic wand do you have? And usually the answer is he doesn't have an answer.
I voted for President Obama twice, but he's wrong here. This is Donald Trump's first 6 months in office. He added 70,000 manufacturing jobs in the United States because he set the expectation that businesses should not send their jobs overseas to other countries. President Trump was the first president to add manufacturing jobs during his first 6 months in office since the 1980s when Reagan got elected. So President Trump added manufacturing jobs his first 6 months in office. What's he done since then? I found data that showed manufacturing jobs adjusted seasonally through September 2018. This comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I recalculated the numbers through December of 2019. Since President Trump took office, we've added over 500,000. 515,000 manufacturing jobs have been added in the United States.
President-elect Donald Trump taking credit for saving American manufacturing jobs from going to Mexico. A campaign promise he made to Carrier employees in Indianapolis.
But we're not going to let them just take our companies out, fire everybody. These are people with Carrier for many, many years. We're not going to let it happen.
Trump and Carrier both tweeting overnight. They have reached a deal to keep close to 1,000 jobs in Indy after the company's announcement back in February.
The best way to stay competitive and protect the business for long term is to move production from our facility in Indianapolis to Monterrey, Mexico.
The parent company, United Technologies, planned to shutter its Carrier plant in Indianapolis that employs 1,400 workers and a nearby plant in Huntington that employs 700, saving the company, according to the workers' union, more than $65 million a year in labor costs. A move Carrier's union rep, Chuck Jones, says would have destroyed many workers' lives.
I'm going to give him 100% of the credit. I wasn't a Trump supporter. In fact, I hammered him pretty good. And when I see him tomorrow, I'm going to tell him, you know, I hammered your ass pretty good, but I'm going to give you credit because what you said you was going to do, you fulfilled that promise, and I appreciate it.
Okay, so my homecoming wasn't quite like that. In fact, I wasn't back in Flint more than a few days when the bad news hit.
This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting. Good evening. General Motors confirmed it today. It is going to close plants employing almost 30,000 workers.
Today, we are announcing the closing of 11 of our older plants.
While Detroit and Pontiac will certainly be hurt by the shutdowns, the effect on Flint is absolutely devastating.
Devastating wasn't the half of it. I mean, maybe I got this wrong, but I thought companies lay off people when they've hit hard times. GM was the richest company in the world, and it was closing factories when it was making profits in the billions.
We do not have any plan to cut our workforce by 80,000. That was kind of a what happens if type of thing.
So this was GM chairman Roger Smith, and he appeared to have a brilliant plan. First, close 11 factories in the U.S., then open 11 in Mexico, where you pay the workers 70 cents an hour. Then use the money you've saved by building cars in Mexico to take over other companies, preferably high-tech firms and weapons manufacturers. Next, tell the union you're broke, and they happily agree to give back a couple $2 billion in wage cuts. You then take that money from the workers and eliminate their jobs by building more foreign factories. Roger Smith was a true genius.
I think our employees have got a new emphasis on job security, and certainly we want to try and help them with that. What do you have to say to Roger Smith?
Boy, it's going to be rough. I kept mentioning Culver.
This was to be the first of many layoffs in Flint, the final day for the GM truck plant.
Well, I think most of you are aware that this is the first major plant closing to take place in Flint. Let me rephrase that. This is not a plant closing. It's a loss of one product line.
My friends and I decided to pose as a TV crew from Toledo to sneak inside the factory. Now, I wasn't exactly sure what a TV crew from Toledo looked like, but apparently the ruse worked as we filmed the last truck going down the line.
Well, what's everybody so happy about? They just lost their job. Everybody's applauding. They just lost their job.
The candidates will have an opportunity to make a closing statement. So, President Bush, I think you said it earlier, let's get it on.
Let's go.
And I think the first question is over here.
Yes, I'd like to direct my question to Mr. Perot. What will you do as president to open foreign markets to fair competition from American business and to stop unfair competition here at home from foreign countries so that we can bring jobs back to the United States?
While Germany was taxing American cars at 10% as they entered the country, and Japan was taxing our automobiles at 6.6%, there was no importation tax from a German or a Japanese car as it entered the United States. One effect of this was the number of imported cars into the United States went up greatly in the 1970s. In 1970, import cars were about 1/7 of total car production or registrations in the United States. It was 14% of the market in 1970. That had doubled by 1981. So Americans were buying more and more cars from overseas, and you see the effect, particularly in the gross domestic product of Japan. Look what happened from 1970 till 1992. As Japan was able to sell cars to the USA tax-free, and as they were taxing our cars at 6%, look what happens to GDP by country using purchasing power parity. Japan in 1970 was 1/5 of our size roughly as an economy. Watch what happened as they start exporting more and more and more products to the United States. Now, Japan is exporting more and more products because they're better engineered. Japanese auto workers are using new technology. The Japanese people are exporting things like Sony televisions and Sony Walkmans and video game systems. It's not just automotive industry, but look at this. The Japanese economy was at one time much, much smaller than the United States, and by 1994 they were about half our size.
That's right at the top of my agenda. We've shipped millions of jobs overseas. Just want to get down to brass tacks. First thing you ought to do is get all these folks who've got these one-way trade agreements that we've negotiated over the years and say, fellas, we'll take the same deal we gave you. And they'll gridlock right at that point because, for example, we've got international competitors who simply could not unload their cars off the ships if they had to comply. You see, if it was a two-way street, just couldn't do it. We have got to stop sending jobs overseas. To those of you in the audience who are business people, pretty simple. If you're paying $12, $13, $14 an hour for factory workers, and you can move your factory south of the border, pay $1 an hour for labor, hire a young 25, that's assuming you've been in business for a long time, you've got a mature workforce. Pay $1 an hour for your labor, have no health care, that's the most expensive single element, making a car, have no environmental controls, no pollution controls, and no retirement, and you don't care about anything but making money, there will be a giant sucking sound going south. So if the people send me to Washington, the first thing I'll do is study that 2,000-page agreement and make sure it's a two-way street. One last point here. I decided I was dumb and didn't understand it, so I called a who's who of the folks who've been around it. And I said, why won't everybody go south? They said, we'll be disruptive. I said, for how long? I finally got them up for 12 to 15 years. And I said, well, how does it stop being disruptive? And that is when their jobs come up from $1 an hour to $6 an hour and ours go down to $6 an hour, then it's leveled again. But in the meantime, you've wrecked the country with these kinds of deals.
Everyone
NAFTA cost us jobs.
Hates
I would like to renegotiate it.
NAFTA.
The worst trade deal.
But it wasn't always that way. The North American Free Trade Agreement was supposed to
expand our exports, create new jobs,
and most people were really excited about it. So what actually happened? What did NAFTA do that was good? And what did it do that was bad? To understand that, you have to understand America's relationship with avocados and shoes. One part of NAFTA we don't often think about is this. NAFTA changed how Americans eat. One of the most successful Mexican imports to the U.S. is avocados.
Avocado consumption in the United States has exploded. Going from 1 pound per person to 7 over the course of 20 years.
That's Quartz avocado expert David Yanofsky.
U.S. production has been flat, but Mexican production has been through the roof.
Before NAFTA, Americans didn't eat a lot of avocados. They only had access to them from California and Florida, and only seasonally.
Most of the avocados in the world are grown in Mexico.
And for 80 years, Mexican avocados were banned from the US. Americans didn't even know they liked them. But NAFTA made them available year-round. And it turns out, Americans love avocados.
It has become a much more broadly popular food.
And that has actually created more avocado demand, which has meant good business for US growers too. When it came to avocados, NAFTA was a win-win. It created this whole new staple of the American diet, and it built up this huge part of the Mexican economy. And avocados are just one example of this. Americans now drink a lot of Mexican beer and eat Mexican mangoes and papayas and fresh bell peppers and cucumbers from Canada.
Certain places around the world are better at making certain things, and to create efficiency in the global economy, one nation devotes its resources to the things that it's good at and exchanges those things for the things that another nation is good at or is better at. So the United States is really good at growing corn, and we ship a lot of corn to Mexico. In turn, the United States buys a lot of avocados in the other direction.
And often, that arrangement works out really well. But what if there's something that two countries are equally good at making, and the only difference is that one country has cheaper labor?
Historically, trade deals had been between high-income countries.
Dan Koff is our economics reporter.
The amount of low-skill and high-skill labor in those countries are relatively similar, and so it's not going to have necessarily a dramatic effect on the composition of labor.
But around the time when NAFTA was signed, that balance between the US and Mexico was off. Mexican labor is cheaper. But before NAFTA, that really didn't matter. By the time a Mexican product made it across the border, it'd be slapped with a tax. So Mexican manufacturers were never really a threat. And certain industries in the US were heavily protected by taxes. Like, for example,
shoe manufacturers at that time had something like 15 to 17% tariffs on their product. So, that made it, 17% more expensive to get the product from Mexico. As a result of NAFTA, those tariffs went down all the way to zero over 10 years. And that meant that it was much less appealing to do manufacturing of that good in the United States. And those jobs basically disappeared.
And that's the story we're familiar with by now. Cheaper Mexican labor means the jobs go to Mexico. But changes like that affected more than just the manufacturing jobs.
It was not only the people who worked in the factories that lost their jobs, but even the people surrounding them. So if you worked in a coffee shop, or if you worked in a department store in a town that relied on that shoe manufacturer, you would also lose your job.
That's how an entire shoe manufacturing town can be devastated by NAFTA. But 100 miles away from that town, you might have no idea. And that is emblematic of how Americans experience NAFTA's pros and cons. The pros were spread around, a little bit of benefit to a lot of people.
Whether you're in Texas or you're in Washington State or Massachusetts, you can now get shoes cheaper as a result of the products that were made in Mexico. You might be able to get avocados year-round.
And most Americans probably didn't even notice those changes. Who really thinks about NAFTA every time they pick up an avocado at the grocery store? But the cons of NAFTA were concentrated. For a relatively small group of people, the pain was deep. And it was deepest in the American South.
The people who will definitely notice are the people who lose their jobs.
And that is the question at the core of NAFTA. On balance, Americans probably saved money because of it. And they got stuff that they wouldn't have had otherwise. And some people lost their jobs. Was it worth it?
The most important aspect, I think, of this debate is that what we are discussing with the TPP is not a new concept. It's not like somebody came up and said, I got a great idea. Let's try this trade agreement, and it's going to be really good for the American worker and the American middle class and the American people. The truth of the matter is that we have seen this movie time and time and time again. And let me tell you that the ending of this movie is not very good. It's a pretty bad ending. And I think most Americans understand that our past trade agreements have failed American workers and have led to the loss of millions of decent paying jobs. And what I simply don't understand, if we were going forward in the first place, new idea, maybe give it a shot. But when we went forward with Nafta, went forward with CAFTA, went forward with permanent normal trade relations, and we heard all of these folks telling us how great these agreements were going to be, and it turned out that virtually everything that they said was inaccurate, not true. Why in God's name would we go forward with another trade agreement, which is in fact larger than previous trade agreements? And let me just give you an example of what I mean, Mr. President. On September 19, 1993, President Bill Clinton said the following, quote, "I believe that NAFTA will create 200,000 American jobs in the first 2 years of its effect. I believe that NAFTA will create 1 million jobs in the first 5 years of its impact," end of quote. President Clinton was pushing the NAFTA agreement very, very hard. Was President Clinton right? Was the Heritage Foundation right? Was Senator McConnell right? No. I think the evidence is pretty clear that they were all wrong. According to the well-respected economists at the Economic Policy Institute, and their facts are usually hold up pretty well, NAFTA has led to the loss of more than 680,000 American jobs. 680,000 American jobs. What President Clinton said was wrong. What the Heritage Foundation said was wrong. We lost substantial numbers of jobs. In 1993, the year before NAFTA was implemented, the United States had a trade surplus with Mexico of more than $1.6 billion. Last year, the trade deficit with Mexico was $53 billion. We had a trade surplus of $1.6 billion. Last year, we had a deficit of $53 billion. Now, how is that a success? I don't quite know.